The first category is Best Civil Rights Activist. All human rights defenders in the US were considered to determine the individual who made the greatest positive impact upon the country's growth and development without the use of violence. The impact of nominated activists shall be weighed with consideration given to both the scope and magnitude of their struggle, furthering civil rights over their respective timeframes. And the three nominees are William Lloyd Garrison, Ida B. Wells, and Martin Luther King Jr. William Lloyd Garrison began the radical abolition movement with his creation of the Liberator newspaper in 1831, condemning slavery as a national sin. Garrison advocated for the immediate abolition of slavery without compensation to slave owners. In 1833, he founded the American Anti-Slavery Society, which sponsored speaking tours and published pamphlets. Garrison's radicalism soon led to dissents from moderates in the abolition movement, but he maintained his rigid moral views and faithfully supported emancipation brought by the Civil War. Ida B. Wells was an American journalist who campaigned against lynching and Jim Crow laws in the 1890s, promoting justice for blacks. After being freed from slavery, she pursued higher education and became an editor of the Memphis Free Speech newspaper. She traveled across the U.S. as a lecturer and organizer of anti-lynching societies, and published countless writings, including a Red Record, to further attract attention to the issue. She was one of the founders of the NAACP and various women's suffrage groups, persisting in her work despite death threats forcing her to relocate to the North. And Martin Luther King Jr. was a Baptist minister and activist who led the civil rights movement in the United States during the mid-20th century. As the president of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, he rose to national prominence during the Montgomery bus boycott and continued to promote nonviolent tactics, such as the Birmingham Campaign and the 1963 March on Washington. His leadership was fundamental to the civil rights movement's success in ending legal segregation in the U.S. with the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and in pushing for other political actions, such as the Voting Rights Act of 1965 and the 24th Amendment. And the winner of this category is Martin Luther King Jr. MLK is the best civil rights activist in U.S. history because many of his efforts were enshrined in law. Ida B. Wells was an early civil rights activist who raised awareness for the widespread brutality of lynchings, but MLK led a movement that successfully achieved legislative protections, such as the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And William Lloyd Garrison's push for immediate abolition may have been the most radical of the antebellum era, but he couldn't unite enough Northerners to create political change. MLK's nonviolent tactics made his platform popular and effective in mass demonstrations. And in MLK's acceptance speech, he says, "I am honored to accept this award on behalf of a movement that wouldn't be possible without the millions of African Americans, as well as supporters who continue our fight against racial injustice. America was founded by brave souls who willingly suffered for righteousness' sake, and this recognition of my humble role in our nonviolent demonstrations have opened a new, peaceful era of progress and hope for all Americans." The second category is Best Technological Innovation. All innovations widely used in the U.S. were considered to determine the one that made the greatest positive impact upon the country's growth and development. The impact of nominated innovations shall be weighed with consideration given to both scope and magnitude over their respective timeframes. And the three nominees are railroad, television, and internet. The first U.S. railroad lines were built in the late 1820s, drastically improving transportation in the North and Midwestern regions. The rapid and reliable links between regions gave farmers the ability to transport crops efficiently and allowed manufacturing and trade to spread across the nation's domestic markets. The railroad's speedy transports also gave the Union a crucial advantage during the Civil War, as railroads were less developed in the South. Railroads continued to expand in the monopolized economy of the Gilded Age and remained widely used in the U.S. today. In the 1950s, the television quickly overtook newspapers, magazines, and radios as a source of information and entertainment, contributing to growing homogeneity of American culture. TV programming was dominated by national networks, which broadcasted westerns, quiz shows, professional sports, and comedies, emphasizing nuclear families and conservative values by depicting stereotypical suburban life. As affordable TVs proliferated in the US, an audience of millions was able to witness presidential debates, the moon landing, real-time coverage of the Vietnam War, and the preachings of televangelists. Cable networks like CNN continue to increase coverage and offer viewers different opinions to this day. The Internet was popularized in the 1990s, with the newly created World Wide Web able to send graphics and communications across the globe. This enabled a boom in information technology and dot-com businesses, with companies like IBM, Microsoft, and Google developing computers and browsers for commercial use. Internet usage continued to increase during the COVID pandemic, with online communications and e-commerce companies becoming vital in the modern era. And the winner of this category is the television. The best technological innovation in U.S. history is the television, which was central to family life for almost all Americans in the late 20th century, and continues to be used today. While railroads were a more efficient form of transportation in the 19th century, roads and canals were functional alternatives. TV was the first medium that could provide live coverage and nationwide broadcasts, greatly shifting popular opinion during the Tet Offensive and protests of the Civil Rights era. In comparison, TV also fostered national unity, with sitcoms idealizing white, middle-class suburban life, unlike the Internet, which raised ongoing issues of digital privacy, surveillance capitalism, and cyber attacks. So, the acceptance speech for television was given by CBS, which states, "We would like to thank the Academy for recognizing our efforts to provide compelling news and entertainment programming across platforms for our American audience. Of course, our growth wouldn't be possible without their support, and we will strive to continue reporting on current events and provide stimulating content for the public."